I can't wait to go and look at that hashtag, but there you go. It's really rude to actually look at your device. I have to speak right, lean forward. So is that right? My posture's very bad now. So look, I'd like obviously to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet this afternoon, and I pay my respect to the elders past and present and emerging. Kerri-Lee, Krause and I are not sure what we've done wrong to offend the conference organisers. We are speaking at the end of what's been a really interesting but quite long day. So congratulations those of you who are still here. We appreciate it. And I do understand, having just slipped out quietly a moment before, that we do actually stand between you and drinks. So what we wanted to do this afternoon is to provide you with an update on what the Higher Education Standards Panel's been doing and what it is doing. I think it's probably important, given the theme of the conference in relation to partnerships in driving quality, to realise that everything that the panel does, we are required to consult broadly. And you'll see that as a standard pattern of our activities: communications, engagement, seeking feedback. And in fact, we had a fantastic activity yesterday, more of in a moment. So let me just advise you and remind you about the role of the panel. So the panel is established. It's a statutory authority established to provide the Minister for Education and TEXA with advice. And indeed, one of its key functions is to advise and make recommendations in varying the higher education standards. So there can't be changes to the higher education standards without the panel being consulted and the panel making a recommendation back to the Minister. The panel also provides TEXA with advice on the interpretation of the standards or other matters relating to the standards. And since the 30th of October 2019, since recent legislation, TEXA also has, the HESP also has the statutory responsibility to advise TEXA on its strategic objectives, corporate plan, performance, and any reform agendas and opportunities to streamline or deregulate our sector. In practical terms, you can see this is an extraordinarily broad remit, which cuts across the whole area of higher education quality in this country. And as I've mentioned, under this legislation, the panel must consult interested parties in carrying out its work. Generally meet 4 times a year and undertake a number of significant consultation events around any proposed changes to standard, or indeed looking at any of the issues which we're actually focusing on. If I just wanted to introduce you to the panel. So clearly I'm the chair, Professor Kerri-Lee Krause is the deputy chair, Adrian Neuenhaus, who's the Director and Vice Chancellor's Office at the University of South Australia, is a member. Dr. Sadie Heckenberg, who's a research fellow at Swinburne University, is a member. Dr. Crystal Evans, who's the Head of Communications and Government Affairs at GSK Vaccines, is a member. Phil Honeywood is a member. I've just seen Phil walk in. And Don Owers is a member, representing a broad sector. Ken Anderson, who's now the Minister's advisor, was up until the time of his appointment also a member of the panel, and I imagine that at some stage the Minister will make another appointment to the panel. So you can see that the panel has a broad background, and a broad expertise. The panel has engaged with a number of significant topics through the period of its operation. The panel that I just showed you was appointed in April of last year. We run until March 2021. A number of key issues the panel has looked at, and in one sense has finished its work, although as I speak about each of these, you'll see that in fact much of the work continues to be ongoing. The panel either receives a reference from the Minister, and in fact when the Minister appoints the panel, as he's done on 2 previous times, he will provide the panel with a list of areas that he actually wants looked at. At a later stage during the term of the panel, he might also refer other matters to the panel, and the panel itself will initiate particular areas that it looks at. So some of the recent work that the panel has, or in recent years the panel's looked at and there's been activity around, One is in relation to professional accreditation. The panel provided advice to the Minister for Education and Training at the end of 2017, recommending the development of a code of practice for professional education and professional accreditation. Many of you know that that's been an interesting and indeed at times fraught issue. In principle, acceptance of the recommendations was announced by the Minister in February 2018, and the advice was released for stakeholder feedback in April 2018. There's been a series of discussions with professional bodies, Universities Australia and others during December 2018 and January 2019, seeking on views on how a legislative code of practice might work in this area. This activity is continuing. The second one, and it's been discussed, and Anthony mentioned it today, is in relation to academic integrity. The panel provided advice to the Minister in March 2017, recommending that legislation be enacted to deter contract cheating, and indeed a series of other recommendations as to how academic integrity could be enhanced. Measures based on this advice were announced in May 2018 and in the 2018-19 budget, including additional funding for TEXA for its role in supporting this legislation. I know a number of you were consulted in relation to the exposure drafts of the bill to outlaw contract cheating. And I think over the next, I expect that we'll hear more about this legislation in the not too distant future. The third one, and of course the panel was in relation to admissions transparency and indeed led to the development of Course Seeker. The panel provided a report on improving the transparency of higher education admissions. This was published in July 2017. A joint higher education sector and Australian government implementation plan was developed in a fantastic partnership involving people from across the higher education sector and from government, and that panel was led that group was led by Professor Kerri-Lee Krause. Commitment to implement that was established, and a whole range of activities, all of the institutions basically committed to and indeed provided the first stage of that process in terms of publishing transparent information about admissions. I note Anthony McLaren today in his presentation at the beginning made reference to the admissions transparency agenda, made reference to Course Seeker and the way in which that's published, and noted that there had been extraordinary work in the first stage of the implementation of that, and that early next year TEXA will undertake an evaluation of the long-term implementation of that particular agenda. And I think he signalled that there were still some areas of improvement. The panel continues to monitor this and continues to take a deep interest in Course Seeker. The panel also undertook work in relation to improving retention, completion and success in higher education, and its report was released on 8th of June 2018. The number of recommendations, in fact 18 recommendations, that focused around areas including the expectation of completion in the current context, supporting students to make the right choice in terms of the courses that they undertake, supporting students to complete their studies, sharing best practice, clarifying the definitions around attrition and retention, and enhancing the transparency of outcomes. Subsequent to this, the Minister wrote to all higher education providers in 2019 asking that institutions implement the panel's recommendation and advise him on their progress. The panel has also undertaken work on the basis of a reference from the Minister in relation to the regulation of Australian campuses overseas and provided advice to the Minister in relation to that. I'm going to stop now and I'm going to hand over to Kerri-Lee, who's going to discuss with you the current work plan of the panel and our future work plan, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. Thank you very much. Kerri-Lee.
I've been instructed to speak into the microphone, so how's that working? As Ian said, we're keen to share with you a little bit more about our current work plan, and then plans for the future. And towards the end, we're going to be asking you about any areas you feel we might have missed, any areas that you can suggest. So there will be time for suggestions and comments on future areas. But on this list here, it speaks for itself, the current work plan. Ian has mentioned a few of these, and starting with the first one, as was mentioned in our workshop yesterday, the Higher Ed Standards Panel has been responsible for overseeing the provider category standards review. We were, in effect, a steering committee, and we met on several occasions with Emeritus Professor Peter Coldrake, AO. And as we mentioned yesterday, we expect an announcement with respect to the Minister's decision. That is yet to come. And in the meantime, we are responsible for considering the implementation implications of the review, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. The second point there is that, as Ian mentioned, we are working even more closely with TEXA to discuss future strategic priorities and to further improve its regulatory approach. As we've heard from Anthony already today, there is a strong commitment on the part of TEXA to continuous improvement, and many of those improvements are already in train, as we heard this morning. In the third point there, assessing the effectiveness of the higher ed standards framework for the regulation of overseas campuses, you'll see several of these points are specifically related to making a judgment, making an assessment about whether there are any implications for amending the standards as we currently have them. In the case of this one, our judgment was that the framework was satisfactory in relation to regulating overseas campuses, but obviously each one of our providers in the sector has ongoing responsibility to make sure that those standards are enacted. On the fourth point, we have been looking at credit transfer policies and standards and whether they are meeting the needs of students and institutions. I note that the AQF review has also looked at the topic of credit transfer, and we have received a draft report, if you like, in relation to credit transfer policies, and I'll talk a little bit more about our future work on this, and the sector will certainly be well acquainted with the consultation process, and we will certainly be coming out to you next year with our assessment of the outcomes of that review, or report. The input to the AQF review, we have been involved in that and met with Peter Noonan and members of the panel on various occasions, and other priorities as necessary, and they have come up in the last 12 months. An example is the outcomes of the French review of freedom of speech and their implications for the standards, so we have considered that important topic. We're also keeping an eye on the outcomes of previous advice from the Higher Ed Standards Panel in areas like, as Ian mentioned, academic integrity, admissions transparency, and institutional responses to the issue of student retention. Let me now build on that to look at where to from here. Obviously, much of that work is ongoing, and there will be a particular focus in the next half of 2020 on the outcomes of the provider category standards review and implementation implications. As Ian mentioned yesterday, for those who weren't in the workshop, the Minister has formally asked the panel to advise him on changes to the standards necessary to implement the recommendations of the provider category standards review. And we had a terrific workshop yesterday. As we mentioned at the end of that workshop, the feedback from that consultation process will go towards a discussion paper that we will share in the first quarter of next year. AQF review implications, obviously that also has important implications for the standards, and again HESP will advise the Minister on any proposed changes to the standards that may flow from the recommendations of the AQF review, and that includes credit recognition, qualification pathways, so that links to our existing work. Regulatory tools is an interesting one. So there was a comment made by Anthony earlier today about work that is ongoing on reinforcing the message about the status of guidance notes, and our role is to examine whether the owners and purpose of emerging regulatory and good practice tools such as guides, advice, model statements, model approaches are clearly identified and fit for purpose and understood by stakeholders within the sector. So we keep a close eye on that, and again, feedback from the sector is very important in that process. I mentioned credit recognition. The report has been commissioned and we are yet to receive a final copy of that. But obviously credit transfer policies and standards are important. We heard about that in the panel earlier in this session. And there is certainly variability in practice, and it would seem that at this stage, it would seem that the standards are adequate, but there certainly is scope for advice, further advice on good practice for providers and enhanced information for students. So we will come out to the sector early next year with further information about that report and a discussion with you on that. And then work integrated learning, there has been a lot of work on work integrated learning, and some may say, why is the Higher Ed Standards Panel continuing to look at this? Our focus is very much on the quality assurance side of will placements, and again, are the standards adequate in this regard? And we have initiated work on this, and again, a report is in train, and we expect that a discussion about credit recognition and work integrated learning will be part of our discussion and consultation with the sector in the first half of next year. So I'm going to finish my part there and leave you with the question about suggestions for future attention, anything you feel we may have missed. And I'm hoping we have microphones on the stage and we'll take questions from here. Thanks very much.